Well, good morning, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Pastor David. I am so glad that you are here with us today on our special Resurrection Day celebration. We're thrilled with it, and it started early because we had a delicious breakfast this morning. That was a very nice thing as well. But we are looking today at risen, at seeing and believing. A while back, I heard someone, not here at church, thankfully, say that they didn't want to go to church to hear some made-up stories in a sermon. And I thought to myself, honestly, it really did shock me because I thought, who would make up stories? I'd never even heard of that idea. Who would make up tearjerker stories to play with people's emotions? I had never simply thought of that before. If I make up a story, you'll know it's a made-up story. Here's a case in point. Did you hear that the Chicago police were investigating the killing of 100 seagulls at the shores of Lake Michigan? Indeed. And the investigation uncovered a note that threatened, "We will leave no turn unstoned." See, you know it's made up, don't you? And you might say pretty poorly made up. I might even agree. But to avoid being accused of making up stories in this sermon, I want to share with you a real story, and one that is a powerful thing. But then again, maybe I should just skip to the last line. The last line of our chapter here today is, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." That's really what you need to know, right? So maybe we don't need all the stories and the lead up and the build up to it. Well, no, of course. The elders are certainly saying, no, that's not what we pay you for, not just to read the last line, right? And so we're sharing today stories that are compelling. And here's one of those. Obviously, hearing just the propositions of truth is not very convincing, but stories convince us. They help us to put us in the narrative, in the story itself. Logic and reasoning further supplement that truth presented in stories. So, way back in the ancient days of 1959, Marolyn Ford was working as a secretary in Holland, Michigan. While at that job one day, just any old random day, everything abruptly went blurry. She became disoriented and told a coworker what was happening, and her coworker pointed to someone who had just come into the room and said, "Can you see her?" She said, "No, I can't see that far." The woman was only 15 feet away. In the course of 2 days, she went from normal eyesight to almost completely blind. Eventually, Marolyn ended up at Mayo Clinic, where she was diagnosed with juvenile macular degeneration. Macular degeneration destroys the retinal nerve and replaces it with scar tissue. In other words, there's no going back. Once the retinal nerves are destroyed, the spontaneous remission is impossible. There was no treatment, so she was told, go home and learn to live with it. 13 years later, she lost the rest of her vision. Earlier, she had lost 94% of her vision. Then she could not even see, she couldn't see detail with that 94% of anything, even the closest things, but she could at least see light. Well, then her mobility instructor held a little lighter, only 6 inches from her eyes. And she could feel the heat. She could smell the fire, but she couldn't see anything. On the night of August 25th, 1972, which was her husband's 33rd birthday, they were both overwhelmed to the point of despair. After reading a short devotional, her husband got on his knees beside the bed and cried out, "Oh God, you can restore Marolyn's eyesight. Lord, I know you can. And God, if it be your will, I pray you will do it tonight." Instantly, after 13 years of total blindness, there was sharpness and light. Marolyn's sight was completely and perfectly restored. She could now perfectly see the husband she had never seen before. She shouted to her husband. She said, AC, I can see. What do you mean you can see? You're kidding. AC replied, there's a prayer of faith. That would be something I would say. I can see the pupils of your eyes, and I can see your rosy cheeks. It's 1 a.m., and I can see that you need a shave. He grabbed the newspaper and asked her to read the large print. She said, no, I can do better than that. I can read the fine print. Now, if that wasn't a big enough miracle for you, here's the rest of the story. Later that week, her ophthalmologist confirmed that, yes, she could indeed see, but medically speaking, nothing had changed. The macular was still full of holes. The nerve endings were still dead. The doctor acknowledged that it was impossible for her to be seen, yet she could see. She was told by the assistant, the medical assistant that was taking notes for the doctor later on, that after that appointment, the doctor went back to his office and sat there in dumbfounded silence for 20 minutes. She was so awkward. I mean, it just felt so awkward in this silence. It's like she's supposed to be taking notes and he's not saying anything. And he said to her, I don't know what that lady is seeing with. I don't know what to tell you to put in her record. I've never seen anything like it. Who says real life stories are boring, right? And this is from a time, our time. Well, I was born in 1972. I don't know about some of you younger ones, but nonetheless, it was from our time. These are people that this person, this author, went to and investigated and researched and talked to the people that were a part of that. He has the records from beforehand and the records afterward. And he can see this is a modern day miracle. So when we say, I have seen the Lord, it's a pretty exciting thing for us to think about, that I have seen the Lord. And that brings us to this evidence of seeing. Perhaps more than any other sense, if we see something, we trust it to be true. That being the case, Mary Magdalene, when she and those that she were with, when they were presented with a bit of a conundrum when they went to the tomb on that resurrection Sunday. They went to the tomb, and I say those that she was with, by the way, even though John doesn't necessarily list those other women that were there. Nonetheless, Mary says in John's gospel, we don't know where they've put him. So using that pronoun, it certainly fits with the other gospels that do list Mary, the mother of James, and Salome as well, that went along with it. Again, the Lord working together, even through different gospels, to share the truth of this witness. So these witnesses were witnesses to the fact of the resurrection, and it just kept adding up. There's a bit of a problem, though. There's no body. Okay, the Jews had stolen the body. At least that's the conclusion that Mary Magdalene came to. It wasn't that the disciples stole the body. That's what the Jews accused her of. But no, she accused them of stealing the body. They've taken the body, and I don't know where they've put him. That was the accusation. Well, and then they come along and say, no, the disciples have taken the body and we don't know where they put it. And Jesus comes along and says, the body ain't dead. I mean, that's the real conclusion that you should come to. That's where the evidence leads. As the reason the tomb was empty. I can't believe Mary's conclusion that the Jews would have stolen the body. After all, the absence of the body has been a major problem for the Jews since the time of the resurrection. If they wanted to put an end to this whole charade, to this whole thing about about whether Jesus had risen from the dead, they could do that very easily just by producing the body of Jesus. If, in fact, they had taken it. If they hadn't taken it, well, that's a different story, isn't it? I mean, if they had taken it, well, what would they have done with a body? Think about that for a minute. What, did they take it to the high priest's house, leave it in the guest room for 2 or 3 days or something like this and say, all right, he's done with it. He doesn't want this sitting around in his house anymore. I mean, that's just a little bit weird, wouldn't you say? Especially since all the grave cloths were there. I mean, the Jews are going to take that? No, I just cannot believe that. But likewise, I can't believe that the disciples would have taken it. I can't believe that thieves would have taken it. Why would they? Why would they steal a body and leave the only valuable thing that's there? So this idea that thieves stole the body, well, this takes even more imagination to dream up. How many thieves do you know will rob the grave of a dirt-poor construction worker who had been unemployed for the past 3 years? He had no jewelry or treasures or possessions at all. The only thing of value in that grave would have been the 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes that had been put on the body, but those had already been scattered all over the grave. The other thing of value would have been the grave cloths themselves, which were there. So the problem is that all those spices are scattered and used, and the grave cloths are there. So these guys are worse than the Three Stooges, if you think about it. Somehow they get past the guards, then they roll away the stone, then they break into this 3-foot opening in order to get into the grave. They climb in, they take extra time to undress the body, and then they pass this stiff corpse through this 3-foot hole. Why? To steal just the body and leave the only thing of value? It just is beyond comprehension, isn't it? These would not be your most talented thieves. This is less believable than if you had, in fact, tried to convince me that the Three Stooges stole the body. Here's another fanciful explanation: the swoon theory. You've probably heard of this one. It's the idea that Jesus didn't actually die, but he swooned. In other words, he passed out into a comatose sort of state. Well, let me just point out the obvious fact here that Roman soldiers were paid to kill people. They were paid to put people to death. They did not mistake that. In fact, when you recall, the soldiers were brought in to verify that everyone was dead, and so they broke the legs of the people there. These Roman soldiers were not called in to put people to sleep. They're not the guys you would call to help your toddler sleep through the night. They're people that their soldiers are people that put people to death. As a proof of their thoroughness in their job, they broke the legs of the 2 men that were on either side of Jesus. But when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. Who would know that for sure? Executioners. Executioners would know, the guy's dead. No sense breaking the legs of a corpse. He's gone. But they wanted to make sure, so nonetheless, they took a spear and ran it through underneath his ribs and into his heart. Not many people can survive that sort of thing, swoon or no. When they came to Jesus, he was already dead, and so they didn't need to break his legs. How did a spear into the heart of Jesus verify that he was dead? Blood and water flowed. That's the way that John describes it. A modern doctor would probably say red blood cells and plasma had already separated. John wasn't a doctor, but nonetheless, that's what we would get out of this. Plasma is the liquid, kind of almost a clear sort of liquid, that is the liquid component of blood, which contains proteins and electrolytes and other biomarkers. It comprises about 55% of blood. And it's useful for treating people with clotting disorders or burns. Red blood cells comprise about 45% of blood, and red blood cells are useful for treating anemia or blood loss. The bottom line is find a blood bank and donate blood. No, that's not the bottom line. The bottom line is blood and water flowed. That means that during this time on the cross, death had occurred. And the blood had separated from the plasma. Sorry, no swoon theory. We can say the same for the LSD theory. I know that was just manufactured in the 1960s, but nonetheless, people have this idea that somehow Jesus was given some magical drug on that stick when he was given that vinegar, and that made him pass out and lowered his heart rate and whatever for 3 days. But again, it doesn't pass that. I could imagine 3 days of sleep, okay? I could imagine that might be pretty restful. But not if someone's sticking a spear in my side. That's not restful sleep. Not even a CPAP will help you sleep through that. The best evidence with the eyewitness accounts and the presence of the guards and the absence of anything of value and the biological markers of scourging and crucifixion, and most of all, the absence of a body, show that Jesus rose from the dead, just as he said he would. When Mary said, "I have seen the Lord," the rational response is to believe her. It would be irrational for you not to believe her, to go against the evidence and not to believe. Go where the preponderance of evidence leads. It leads to faith in Jesus. So that brings us to our second point, which is breaking out of your fear-locked room. And this is in verses 19 through 23. That being the case, what will the evidence do for you? Will it make you bold enough to fully throw yourself into faith in Jesus? Maybe this time, today, in 2025, that this will be the time that you finally commit to Jesus. Will it make you so convinced of the truth that Jesus is Lord that you forcefully turn away from that sin that you've been walking in up to this point? Verses 19 through 23 answer that for us. Even though these people had seen the empty tomb, and even though some of them had seen Jesus himself, that night the disciples locked themselves into a room because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. How often do we lock ourselves in a room of our own mess? How often do we allow fear of danger or of people or of embarrassment to lock us in our room? We can relate to the disciples, can't we? But here's the amazing thing. Just when we think we are alone in our fear or sin or miry pit, Jesus is there with us. We're not alone. Jesus is there to counsel and encourage us. We might not understand how Jesus got in the room, and that was definitely a question that the disciples had going through their minds as well. Peter, somebody probably turned to Peter and said, "Peter, I thought you locked the door." And he goes and he says, "I did. It is." Hi, Jesus. Are you here alone? Did Moses or Elijah come with you this time? I mean, they were as curious as anybody. How did Jesus get there? The door was locked. You know, I have another question about this. If Jesus was able to go through a door, why did he have to go through a door? Why couldn't he come through the walls? I mean, he could have come through the floor, right? He could have come through the ceiling. So maybe he was just beamed in like Scotty. He's just there. In any case, he's there with them. When they least expect it, Jesus is there. When they seem like, I've messed up so badly, I've just locked myself away, I'm just gonna confine and hold right into this little spot here where it's safe, Jesus is there. And he calls them out. It's almost as though Jesus says, "I came so that you may go." And that's what we find a little bit later here. But when Jesus rose from the dead, how did John describe the cloths at the tomb? So I want to just explore this a little bit because it does pertain to how Jesus got into that room. So when Jesus rose from the dead, how does he describe the cloth there? So here we have it. "And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in." This is John. This is the author of the book. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm pondering this, and I get the sense that the grave cloths were lying exactly where Jesus was, in exactly the same position that they were when they were on Jesus. In other words, we get the sense that Jesus was resurrected through the grave cloths. Unlike Lazarus, you remember, he came out, just couldn't release himself because he was all tied up, right? We could have expected the same sort of thing of Jesus, that he would have been so wrapped up tightly that he could not get out. And yet, there the cloths are, just lying there where they were. So we get the sense that he came through those cloths, but yet he didn't come through the face cloth. And so I get the idea that he unwrapped the face cloth, showing the glory of God on his face as it came out, and it must have been a glorious thing. I am certain that the angels were just watching this, just cheering and erupting far more than we even did while we were worshiping here today. It makes me think of him getting out of the tight wrappings, but then unveiling his face, the glory of God in the Son of God. It's an exciting thing for me to play around with, to think about how that would be. And so we get the sense that when we ask about a door or a wall or a ceiling or a floor, Jesus could have come through any one of those. We get the sense that his body was such, as a resurrected body, that it was not confined to the material world, and yet it could interact with the material world. He didn't come through that face cloth. He took that off himself, but he came through the other cloths, or he came through the door, or he came through the floor, whatever it was. It's a marvelous thing for us to think of. It is going to be glorious simply to have these sort of bodies when we're resurrected. To be in the material world, but not confined to the material world. That will be awesome. I want to note the state of mind of the disciples, though, here. As we read about Jesus and what he said when he first came in, he said, "Peace be with you." And what perfect words for Jesus to say to those who had locked themselves away because of fear. Peace be with you. Peace from the King of Peace. The King of Peace, who had been raised in the city of peace, after he had himself, not a week earlier, had just ridden a donkey in that had never been ridden before. He had spoken peace to that donkey. In the midst of this crowd, he expressed that he was the King of Peace. He didn't come in with warfare and fighting, calling his disciples to arms. He came in peace, and that's just what they needed to hear. I want you to note the state of the mind of the disciples here. They were filled with fear. Every one of the disciples, even John, who had stuck with Jesus right to the end and was at the cross, even he was locked away in fear in this room. John was there with Jesus, but he was brave at one time, but then here he's locked away. Now I want you to picture what happens in the next 40 days. Jesus made many appearances. Some of those were to individuals. Some of them were to small groups of people. Some of them were to all the disciples. At least one of those instances was to 500 people at one time. And in fact, when Paul cited that fact in 1 Corinthians 15, he said, many of them are still alive. Go ask them. He's basically daring them. Hey, if you want to know the truth, go talk to the people that saw him. 500 people at one time saw Jesus raised from the dead. Most of all, look at the disciples. In those 40 days, they went from chickens tied up confined into a room, to people that boldly said, to the very people that crucified Jesus, they said, "But Peter and John answered them, 'Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard.'" What changed? What would cause them to go from being chickens locked away from the scary Jewish leaders to boldly standing up to those same leaders, knowing that their lives were on the line? Let's look at the words of those Jewish leaders themselves in order to answer this. They say, "Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, common men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus." That was the change. That was the change. No one and nothing could convince them that what their eyes were seeing was not real. They knew it was Jesus. They spent time with Jesus. They sat down and ate with Jesus and drank with Jesus. They continued to hear him explain all of the prophecies, all of these things from the very beginning, and how they fulfilled Jesus coming as the Messiah. Nothing and no one could convince them that this was not real, that they had not seen the resurrected Jesus. Jesus came back from the dead, and they saw it with their own eyes. They believed what they saw, and Jesus sent them to tell others, "I have come so that you may go." That's really what we can, if we were to summarize verse 21, it would be that. "I have come so that you may go." And wow, look at what happened when they did go. Thousands upon thousands came to believe in a matter of days. The gospel spread like wildfire, and so did the oppression. So did the opposition. This is perhaps the most convincing argument in my mind of the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. A majority of those disciples paid for their message with their lives. If it had been a conspiracy, if it had been all a big joke or a hoax or a legend or something like this, somebody would have cracked. But every one of them, or close to every one of them, paid for it with their lives. They all died this way. They all died being thrown to animals or being beheaded or crucified upside down. Horrific deaths. But they were willing to do that rather than to betray what they had seen with their own eyes. If this was a conspiracy, they all held strong to the very end and didn't crack a single word of doubt even to the end, even though they had shown themselves to be chickens earlier on. Again, it stretches beyond belief. Jesus rose from the dead. And here's the last thing. I kind of look at these verses and I think, wow, this is permission, basically, to believe. You may believe. As you consider the story of Jesus, consider the way that the Gospels record the evidence. The evidence is more than just the prophecies that were fulfilled. I've kind of recounted those over the past week here, that we've been focusing on those prophecies and how God predicted 700 years beforehand that things would happen exactly the way that they did. So that's convincing in itself that God controls all of those things. The evidence is more than just the prophecies. The evidence is more than just the empty tomb, although that alone puts the onus of proof on the skeptic. How do you explain the empty tomb? The evidence is more than just the complete transformation of the lives of the disciples. Those who had locked themselves away in cowardice at one point, but had gladly accepted the punishment of death for their faith because they had seen Jesus with their own eyes. The evidence also includes the fact that women were those who first discovered the resurrection. John Stott, he's a pretty, he was a formidable theological teacher, but he was convinced by this thing alone, that this was the truth, when he was, I think, a teenager. The fact that women found Jesus was the thing that convinced him that this was the truth. Well, how is that? Because women's testimony was near worthless at that time. In other words, if there was going to be a conspiracy, if you were going to make up a legend, make up a myth that you wanted people to believe, you would not have women find this person in order to then tell everybody else, yeah, this is how it happened. Trust me. Why should we trust you? You know, even in a court of law, your testimony isn't valuable. And that was the thing that convinced John Stott this was absolutely true, because if it had been a myth, if it had been a legend that was built up, men would have been the people that would have found him. And here's another thing. Thomas was a skeptic. You would have had, if you were going to make something up, you would have had everybody believe immediately. Oh, everybody believed, and off they went happy into the... No, that's not the way it happened, was it? Thomas was such a skeptic that he demanded physical proof. I want to put my hand in his side. I want to put my fingers in the holes that I saw in his hands. And that was the sort of person that he had. So here's a skeptic that demanded the evidence that was convinced. And what was his answer? What was his conclusion of the whole thing? My Lord and my God. That's what he came to. That's the conclusion that he came to. Now, we've been memorizing 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 4 this month. We've been reading it as a congregation each week. Why this verse? Because it is the most concise presentation of the gospel, perhaps in the whole Bible. The book of Corinthians was written by Paul. So let's read what he said. Just the first part, what he said about this. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Now, if you know anything about Paul, he had a hard time convincing people that his apostleship was genuine. And in fact, in Corinth in particular, the whole second book of Corinthians was written to show, hey, I'm an apostle just like the other apostles. So if Paul was trying to convince people, he would not have gone back to something that someone else taught him, something else that he received from someone else. And so we ask ourselves, well, when did he receive this, as he says here? That would have been after he came to faith, the miraculous revealing of Jesus on the Damascus Road. He came to faith and he went back to Jerusalem, and he was actually held at arm's length by the disciples. But nonetheless, through Barnabas, they kind of said, okay, yeah, come alongside him. He's genuine. He's authentic. And then he was taught. He was instructed in the way. What was he taught? For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. When did Paul receive this? This would have been within the first 5 years of Jesus dying. And here's what it says. Now, Jesus did many other things. I'm sorry. I'm going to skip a little bit here. That means within 5 years of these actual events, Christians were memorizing and sharing these verses as the core of the gospel. Before we read these verses, I want to conclude by reading these last verses of John chapter 20 as an encouragement to you. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. It is rational for you to believe. It makes sense for you to believe. You may believe that Jesus is the Christ. It is supported by evidence. It is a miracle, to be sure, but that's what makes it a once-in-history event. If you haven't expressed your faith, your belief in Jesus up to this point, take this opportunity. I encourage you, as we read these verses together, take this opportunity, read these as an expression of your belief. Would you please stand with me? Let's read these verses together. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, I pray that many people here today are looking to you for the first time with eyes opened through faith, that they can clearly see, just as Marolyn Ford did, just as you did for me or the disciples or Thomas, the doubters. Lord, open our eyes in faith. In Jesus' name, amen.